My stepmother demanded we take my dementia dad out of his own home before she even filed for divorce. We had 48 hours and no legal rights. She called on a Sunday morning. Not texted. Called. And the moment I heard her voice, I knew it was not a "how are you" call, because Linda has never made a "how are you" call in the 11 years she has been married to my father. She said she needed to talk to me about arrangements. She used that word specifically. Arrangements. Like my father was a piece of furniture she had decided no longer fit the room. Like the man who raised me, who taught me to drive, who cried at my university graduation with his whole chest, and did not try to hide it, had become a logistical matter requiring arrangements. She said she wanted him out of the house before the end of the week. She said she had already spoken to a lawyer. She said she thought it would be easier for everyone if we handled this quickly and without drama. And I sat on my kitchen floor, which is where I ended up without noticing I had moved, and I said nothing for a long time because every word I had available to me in that moment was one I could not afford to say if I wanted to handle this correctly. My father has dementia. He cannot speak for himself. And the woman who had promised to stand beside him was giving me 48 hours to remove him from his own home before she had even filed a single piece of paperwork. I need to tell you about my father before I tell you about what came next. Not because it changes the legal question, but because you need to understand who we were fighting for. His name is Joseph. He is 68 years old. He was an architect for 31 years, the kind who kept paper sketches even when everything moved to software, who had a specific pencil he used for first drafts and would not substitute it for anything. He was precise and patient and quietly funny in the way of people who do not need the room to know they are funny. He remarried when I was 22, 7 years after my mother passed, and I had processed enough of my own grief by then to be genuinely happy for him. Linda was capable and organized and clearly loved him in the way she was capable of loving things, which was real but also managed, controlled, kept inside borders she decided on. The dementia started showing 3 years ago. Small things first, the way it always starts, the things you file under tired or distracted until the filing system stops holding. He forgot an appointment. He repeated a story twice in the same evening. He stood in the kitchen one morning looking at the kettle with an expression I had not seen on his face before, a specific blankness that was not confusion exactly but something quieter than confusion, something that looked like a man who had momentarily lost the thread of a sentence he had been composing his whole life. We got the diagnosis 14 months ago. Moderate stage. Progressing. The doctor used words like trajectory and management and quality of life, and I sat in that office and held my father's hand and watched him nod along to things he was understanding less and less of, and I understood that the person I was holding the hand of was going to become harder and harder to reach, and that reaching him while I still could was the only thing that mattered. Linda had been managing his care at home. I want to give her that. It is not a small thing to manage the daily reality of someone with dementia, the repetition, the disorientation, the moments of lucidity that make the other moments harder by contrast. I do not know what those 11 months of increasing care had cost her. I was not in the house every day. I visited twice a week, sometimes 3 times, and each visit I tried to read the temperature of the household, and what I read was someone who was managing, but managing at a cost she had not fully anticipated when she married a healthy man who wore the same cologne for 30 years and knew the name of every pencil in his collection. But managing at a cost and responding to that cost by demanding his removal in 48 hours before filing for divorce are not the same thing. They are not even close to the same thing. My brother Daniel found out 20 minutes after I did. I called him from the kitchen floor, still on the kitchen floor, and told him what Linda had said. He was quiet for a long time. Daniel is the quieter of the two of us, slower to react, more methodical, which in most circumstances I find grounding, and in this circumstance I found excruciating because I needed him to be as loud as I felt. He said, "Has she filed anything?" She said she spoke to a lawyer. Speaking to a lawyer is not filing anything. She said 48 hours. Daniel. She can say whatever she wants, he said. His voice had a quality I had heard from him only a few times before, a specific controlled flatness that meant he was angry enough to need to keep the anger very tightly managed. She has no legal authority to remove him on her own timeline. He is still her husband. The house is marital property. And he has 2 children who are about to become very informed about what that means. We were on the phone for an hour. By the end of it we had 3 things: the name of an elder law attorney Daniel had found while we were talking, an appointment for Monday morning that Daniel had already booked before we hung up, and a shared understanding that whatever the next week required of us we were going to meet it. I did not sleep Sunday night. Not because of the legal question, though the legal question was real and required answering. Because of my father. Because somewhere in the house he had lived in for 9 years, in the bedroom he had shared with the woman who was now timing his removal, my father was asleep or not asleep, present or somewhere inside the particular distance that dementia creates, and he did not know what Sunday morning had set in motion. He could not know. He did not have the capacity to advocate for himself, to make calls, to understand that his home was under negotiation. He was dependent on the people who loved him to stand in the gap between what was happening and what he could no longer protect himself from. I drove to the house Monday morning before the attorney appointment. I needed to see him before I sat in a lawyer's office talking about him as a legal subject rather than a person. Linda opened the door. We looked at each other across the threshold for a moment. She was wearing the expression she wore when she had made a decision she had prepared herself to defend, that particular set of the jaw, the controlled politeness that she used as a form of distance. I thought we could talk about this calmly, she said. I'm completely calm, I said. Which was true in the way that very cold things are true. She let me in. My father was in the sitting room in his chair by the window, the one he had always preferred because of the light. He was looking out at the garden. When I came in and said his name, he turned, and for a moment, one of those moments that still arrive unexpectedly and still undo me every time, he was completely there. His face opened. He said my name the way he has said it my whole life, 2 syllables with a specific weight on the first one. You came, he said. I always come, I said. I sat with him for 20 minutes while Linda made tea in the kitchen, and the distance between us and that kitchen was the distance between my father in his chair being himself and the phone call that had put me on my kitchen floor the morning before. 20 minutes of him showing me the garden through the window, pointing out a bird he had been watching, telling me something about the roses that he had told me before and that I listened to as if it was new because it was new to him and because these moments of him being present and clear in himself were not something I was willing to hurry through. Then Linda came back and set the tea down and sat across from us and said she hoped I had come to discuss practical next steps. I looked at her over my father's head. He had gone back to the window. I have an appointment with an elder law attorney this morning, I said. I thought you should know. Something moved across her face. Not surprise, she had expected this. Something more like a recalibration. A reassessment of the timeline she had set. I am not trying to be cruel, she said. And I believe she believed that. I have given 11 months to this. I cannot continue. That is an honest thing and I am trying to be honest with you. Honest would have been a conversation, I said. Not a 48-hour deadline before you filed anything. She did not have an answer for that. Or she had one but did not deploy it with my father sitting 2 feet away looking at his roses. I finished the tea. I keyed my father's forehead. He patted my hand and said to drive carefully. I drove to the attorney's office and I walked in and I sat down across from a woman who had spent 20 years in elder law and I told her everything, and I watched her take notes and I held myself together with both hands while the professional language of the situation was laid out in front of me. The news was not entirely what I feared. But it was not simple. And simple was what we did not have time for. Because Linda had not waited for Monday. She had made another call Sunday night. And what she had set in motion while Daniel and I were on the phone was something we had not accounted for. And my father, in his chair by the window, watching his roses, had no idea what was coming. The attorney's name was Margaret Chen, and she had the specific quality of someone who had sat across from enough desperate families to know how to be both honest and steady at the same time. She listened to everything I told her without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Tell me about the diagnosis documentation and whether either you or your brother has any formal legal standing currently." The answer to the second part of that question was no. That was the problem. That was the entire problem contained in one word. My father had been diagnosed 14 months ago. In those 14 months, between managing the emotional reality of watching him change and maintaining the visits and the relationship and the presence, neither Daniel nor I had moved to establish formal legal standing. No power of attorney. No guardianship filing. No documentation that gave either of us recognized authority to make decisions on his behalf or to legally intervene in decisions being made around him. Linda, as his spouse, held that authority by default. Until a divorce was filed and finalized, she was his next of kin in the legal sense that mattered. She was the person whose signature went on forms. She was the person doctors deferred to. She was the person who could, within certain limits that we were now trying to understand precisely, determine where he lived and under whose care. Margaret explained the landscape carefully. She said Linda could not unilaterally remove him from the home in the way of physically forcing him out, but that she could make the environment impossible and the legal situation complicated in ways that would produce the same outcome through different means. She said our most urgent priority was to file for guardianship immediately, which would initiate a process and put the question of his care formally before a court rather than leaving it in the hands of a spouse in the process of exiting the marriage. She said urgent did not mean instant. The process had its own timeline. "How long?" Daniel asked. He had met me at the office. "Weeks minimum," Margaret said. "Possibly longer depending on whether it's contested." "She'll contest it," I said. Margaret looked at me. What makes you say that? Because contesting it keeps her in control of the timeline, I said. And control of the timeline is what this has been about from the beginning. Margaret nodded slowly. Then we file today, and we file thoroughly, and we document everything from this point forward. Every interaction. Every decision she makes regarding his care. Every communication. All of it. We filed that afternoon. Linda was served notification 2 days later. I know the moment she received it because she called me within the hour. The controlled politeness was gone. What replaced it was not quite anger. Linda did not do anger openly, but a version of herself that was operating under pressure and letting some of it show at the edges. She said we were making a difficult situation adversarial. She said she had been the one caring for him for 11 months and we were now treating her like a threat. She said she had rights in this situation that we were choosing to ignore. She said if we had concerns about his care, we could have raised them at any point in the last year rather than responding to one phone call with a legal filing. I let her finish. Then I said, "You gave us 48 hours, Linda. You called on a Sunday morning and told us to remove our father from his home before the end of the week. You had spoken to a lawyer before you spoke to us. We responded to what you gave us." Silence. "I am not your enemy," she said finally. Quieter. "I know you're not," I said. "But you are not his advocate either. And right now he needs one." She hung up. I sat with my phone and felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has been running on adrenaline and clarity for 3 days and can feel the edges starting to soften. Daniel and I established a rotation that week. One of us at the house every day. Not to monitor Linda in an aggressive way, but to be present. To see our father. To make sure the daily reality of his care was being maintained and that he was not being made to feel the weight of what was happening around him in ways he could not process or protect himself from. He knew something was different. People with dementia often know something is different even when they cannot name it. He was quieter some days. More anxious. He asked for our mother once, which he had not done in months, and I sat with him and told him she was not here but that I was and that everything was all right, which was a partial truth delivered in the full tone of a complete one. The guardianship process moved the way legal processes move, which is to say with a complete indifference to the urgency of the people inside it. There were filings and responses and a court-appointed evaluator who came to assess my father and whose report we were not immediately privy to and whose conclusions we had to wait for with a patience that neither Daniel nor I naturally possessed. Linda did contest it. Not aggressively at first. Her initial response was measured, filed through her own attorney, noting her position as spouse and primary caregiver and questioning the necessity of the filing given that she had been managing his care adequately for the duration of his diagnosis. The word adequately sat in that document in a way that I read several times. Our attorney filed a detailed response. The 48-hour phone call was in it. The timeline of the demand relative to the divorce filing was in it. A documented account of the change in my father's presentation on days following what appeared to be stressful household interactions was in it. Daniel had been keeping notes since Monday morning. That discipline, that specific unglamorous discipline of writing down dates and times and what was said and what was observed, turned out to matter more than almost anything else we did. The turning point came from an unexpected direction. My father's primary care physician, a quiet and thorough man named Dr. Okafor who had been managing his care since the diagnosis, submitted a statement to the court. He had not been asked to by either side. He submitted it independently, which Margaret told us was unusual and which told us something about what he had observed and what he felt needed to be on record. The statement noted his concerns about the stability of my father's care environment in light of the changing household circumstances. It noted that patients at my father's stage of dementia were particularly vulnerable to disruptions in routine and environment. It noted that continuity of care and the presence of familiar, consistent people in his daily life was not a preference but a medical consideration. Dr. Okafor had been watching. And he had chosen, on his own, to say something. I cried when Margaret read me the contents of that statement over the phone. Not quietly. The kind of crying that has been waiting for permission and takes it the moment something in the situation shifts toward your father being seen as a person by someone with the authority to say so officially. The guardianship was granted 6 weeks after we filed. Joint guardianship, Daniel and I together. Linda retained certain rights as spouse that would be addressed in the divorce proceedings, but the decisions about my father's care, where he lived, who managed his medical situation, how his daily life was structured, those came to us. We moved him within 2 weeks of the order. Not because the house was the wrong place for him, actually the house was familiar and familiar was valuable, but because the house was no longer stable and stability was what he needed and what we could now provide elsewhere. We found a care arrangement with a small residential facility 10 minutes from Daniel's house, a place with a garden that had roses, which I had specifically looked for and which Daniel had found without me asking, because he knew too. The day we moved my father, I held his hand in the car and he looked out the window, and at one point he turned to me and said, with a clarity that arrived the way his clear moments always arrived, sudden and complete and heartbreaking in their completeness, "Are we going somewhere good?" "Yes," I said. "We are going somewhere good." He nodded and went back to the window. Satisfied. Trusting. That trust, that specific, absolute, uncomplicated trust that he placed in me in the car that day, is the thing I carry when the exhaustion of the last months becomes too heavy. He could not fight for himself. He could not understand the filings and the counterclaims and the evaluator and the weeks of waiting. He could not know what the 48-hour phone call had set in motion, or what we had done in response to it, or what Dr. Okafor had chosen to say, or what the judge had decided. He could only sit in the car and ask if we were going somewhere good and trust the answer. I do not know the full resolution of the divorce proceedings. They are ongoing and they are not my story to tell in detail. What I know is that my father is in a place where he is known and cared for, and where his routine is protected, and where the people who love him can reach him without navigating someone else's crisis to get there. Linda and I have not spoken since the guardianship was granted. I do not know what that silence will eventually become. I do not carry anger toward her the way I did in the first weeks. What she did was wrong in its timing and its framing and its complete absence of consultation. But she was also a person who had been inside something very hard for a long time and had reached a limit and had handled reaching that limit badly. Both of those things are true. I hold both of them without needing to resolve them into something simpler. What I want to tell you, if you are reading this and you have a parent whose capacity is changing and you have not yet done the legal work, please hear this as clearly as I can say it. Do it now. Today if possible. Not because the people around your parent are necessarily threats, but because the absence of legal standing means that when something happens, and something will happen, you will be responding to a crisis rather than inside a structure that can hold the crisis. The paperwork is not a betrayal of trust. It is the opposite. It is building the architecture that protects the person you love when they can no longer build it for themselves. My father asked if we were going somewhere good. I said yes. Make sure, before you need to, that you have the legal standing to make that answer true. Because the people who love your parent are not always the people with the authority to speak for them. And love without authority, when the moment arrives, is not always enough. Build the authority. While there is still time. While they can still look out the window and trust your answer.